But anyways, welcome. Happy Thursday, everybody.
Thank you.
Hey, Jeff, how are you? Nice to see you.
Just fine. Got a bottle of Sonoma Coast Sauvignon Blanc right now.
Fantastic. Who's the producer?
It's Moritzen. They're in Dry Creek. So maybe that's not a coast, but it's over the hill.
You're right. We're in Sonoma County. Absolutely. Well, it's funny that you mentioned that. So first off, I want to welcome, I can't see you anymore, Andy, on my screen, but I want to welcome Andy Peay from Peay Vineyards, who is here with us today to talk about an area known as sort of the true Sonoma Coast, or West Sonoma Coast, as it is going to come to be known. He'll talk a little bit more about what's going on with that in just a little bit. But initially, I was really thinking about doing a class on Sonoma County. We've done some Sonoma County classes before, and it's just an area that I think is so diverse that it really is a lot of fun to talk about. And every time we talk about Sonoma County, we can almost talk about something different. And we were planning to have a winemaker dinner at Corkbuzz in Union Square with Nick Peay and Vanessa Wong, so the winemaker, as well as the vineyard manager. Nick manages the vineyards, Vanessa makes the wines in April. But of course, as we know, the whole world turned upside down in mid-March. So I thought, well, who could we bring to this class with us? And of course, I immediately thought of the Peay family. Reached out to Andy, who does the majority of the marketing. Andy, I would imagine that you typically probably spend a lot of time on the road. So maybe this is a nice respite for you to be at home a little bit more.
Absolutely.
And yeah. And so when I reached out to him, he said, yeah, I'd love to do this Sonoma class with you. He goes, I have a lot to say about the West Sonoma Coast. And I was like, yes, of course, that's right. You know, you're in Annapolis, you're in this amazing climate. You guys are sort of the pioneers of definitely one of the pioneers of this region. And so I said, this is going to be great. So let's focus on the West Sonoma Coast. And then I was telling Andy earlier, so then I started looking into information, and we're going to put together this class on the West Sonoma Coast. And all of the information that I found was coming from Andy. So I'm just so thrilled to have him here, because you're really hearing it here first from kind of the expert, I think, of what's happening within this region. So I'm really excited. If you do have any questions, please ask questions, chit chat. Don't hesitate to throw your hand up, unmute yourself if you'd like to. I'll go ahead and mute everybody except myself and Andy right now. But if you have anything to say, you all know the drill. Just go ahead and say it whenever you're ready. All right, perfect. So we're going to go back and forth, sharing our screen a little bit here. Again, just so excited today. It's just so fun to do these collaborations and these classes. And I always love hearing the expertise of people that are coming from these areas. So let's just start a little bit about Andy. So we want to know, just in general, I'll just let you tell us. We don't need to obviously read off a biography here, but tell us a little bit about how you and your brother Nick came to be in the West Sonoma Coast and in California. You're not from California, right?
No, we're both from Cleveland, Ohio, which is where I'm actually today, which is not really known for wine country, at least not for very good wine country. Mm-hmm. They do make wine up in Northeast Ohio, where I'm from. But we, in our own paths, both ended up in California. My brother, after college, had gone to college with a guy whose family owned Schramsberg. And so he headed out there, started working harvest for Schramsberg and then Newton and La Jota, and went to Davis, and then was down in Santa Cruz making wine in the early 90s. I had gone via Manhattan and New York banking, and then ended up on the West Coast eventually as a European retail wine buyer. And we got together drinking wine a lot and cooking, and said, the wines that we love are wines that taste like they could only come from that specific part of the world. And when we taste it, we're like, oh, that's Nebbiolo. I can tell. Oh, I can tell it's from sandy soils because of this, and because the people who own that, oftentimes multi-generation, but not always, really are focusing on bringing out the expression of sight as opposed to winemaking. Well, in California in the mid-90s, a lot of what was popular were wines that had a lot to do with how they were made. So
Right.
you'd read the Spectator, they'd have the cover, it'd be all about winemakers and what they're doing, not so much about the vineyards and the site, and not about site expression in wines. And so we said, well, you know, we could do this in the new world, and we have to if we're gonna do our own thing, because mom and dad, you know, they don't own a Domaine or Chateau. So we're gonna do this in the new world, but we have to go somewhere colder. So we're not gonna make these big bombastic fruit-driven wines with lots of alcohol that we then have to do things with in the winery to move them into a shape that we like. So we started looking all over, and we ended up in a very northern west part of Sonoma Coast that I'll tell you about in a little bit. But we bought a piece of land up there. There was an old sheep ranch, and everybody said it was too cold and wet and remote. We bought it. Fortunately, Vanessa Wong joined us before our first harvest. Vanessa had been, for years, she'd made wine in France. She was at Lafite Rothschild and Domaine Gros and Von Romane. Came back, was the winemaker, Peter Michael, and then left Peter Michael, became our winemaker, and then married my brother, which was excellent for us because I couldn't afford Peter Michael's salaries. And I'll give you the rest of the Peay story later, but that's how we found our way out there. Looking for a place to make site expressive wines that had elegance, finesse, and
let me ask you this. So were you looking for a site specifically for these Burgundy and Rhone varieties, or were you looking for the site first and then that would dictate the varieties that you wanted to grow and make?
We were looking primarily Pinot Noir. Chardonnay, if you can believe it, was like our security blanket. There's, I think, 3 times as much or 2 times as much Chardonnay planted as the next variety in California, which is amazing. But we were like, hey, everybody likes Chardonnay, so we'll grow that. My brother was making wine in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and he liked some of the cooler areas in the Santa Cruz Mountains for Chardonnay. So, you know, the wines we were drinking, you know, I love white Burgundy, so does he. And so we were like, hey, we like that mineral aspect. We like the kind of the linearity of Chardonnay in a cool place. Syrah was a lark, you know. So we planted Viognier as really for giggles, because my brother had made it on Howell Mountain with La Jota with Bill Smith, and it's very warm there, and it made that big flamboyant fat style, which didn't really interest us. So we're like, well, hey, we'll plant an acre and see what happens out where we are, and it's its own absolutely weird beast. And Syrah got ripe only because we didn't even know it. We're in California, and we're maritime, and we have October, where they don't in continental regions that grow Syrah or other varieties. So that's another whole story I can get into if you want to. But
wow, fantastic. So a lot of you have been with our classes. You know a little bit, or a lot probably at this point, about the history of California. Then really Sonoma really evolved a lot. And actually what I think is interesting, Andy, is, you know, I was reading a lot about just California history again in general, and sort of reacquainting myself and looking for new things. And I learned a couple of things as I was sort of reading over these past few days about some of this California history. One, which makes sense already, but it was put into terms, is that, you know, in the 1800s, especially the mid 1800s, when you know, we were sort of settling these areas of California, grapes were being planted and grown everywhere. But it was even known at that time, of course, that, you know, these coastal areas were really making fine wine. And just as today, it was really just planting more for bulk production, table grapes inland, and that winemakers were really understanding the concept of in California, even if they had come from countries where maybe they had made wine in more continental climates, but they were realizing in California that wasn't working. And they were moving to the coast to make fine wine during the 19th century, which I thought was really interesting as well. And then, of course, we kind of lost a little bit of this understanding the technical know-how during Prohibition, of course, when we weren't making a lot of wine in the area. Another cool thing is I was looking into, you know, the concept of, you know, planting especially Pinot Noir and Chardonnay within California. And I really like what you already said about Chardonnay, looking for these sort of Burgundian, more linear styles, this concept of more transparency, of sort of reading what the soils and the vineyards and the sites are really about, as opposed to what the winemaker is trying to achieve within the winery, which of course we all know is important, but we're really looking for the transparency of site. And I really think that it's interesting that in these coastal vineyards, you know, we're not trying to emulate, we're not trying to make Burgundy Chardonnay, but we're being reflective of, as Chardonnay lovers, why do we keep going back to Burgundy, right? Like it's the spiritual heartland. It's where the grape achieves its best expression. And I really love the concept of like sort of not trying to make this style, but understanding what they're doing with the grape in their region to make the best expression of it with what they have. And I think that's cool that that's happening here. Another really fun thing that I read is, so when we started planting sort of the post-phylloxera Pinot Noir within Russian River Valley, I think it was, and you might know if in case I'm remembering incorrectly, but when Joe Rocchioli Sr. planted his vineyard, he said that he couldn't even sell, he planted Pinot Noir. And he's asked somebody, you know, what he should plant, and they said, oh, you should plant Pinot Noir. And he didn't even know what the grape was. Like he had to write it down to take the name to the nursery with him because he didn't even understand. He couldn't remember because he didn't know the grape what it was. And he said that he couldn't even sell his first couple of harvests to anybody. So he sold them to Gallo, and they went into Gallo's Hardy Burgundy because Russian River Valley, one of the best sites that we really think of today, he couldn't even sell the wine to anybody, into the grapes, anybody making fine wine at that time, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, there's a similar story with David Hirsch out on Fort Ross on the Sonoma Coast. He planted Pinot because one of his hippie buddies, who was already growing fruit down in Santa Cruz, said to his buddy, yeah, I bought this land to kind of get away from everything. He was like, well, you should plant Pinot here. And that was it. Like that was the thought pattern beginning to end.
Right.
A couple things you said I thought were interesting. One of the things that drove coastal cooler climate planting in the 1800s may have been looking for quality. I'm not sure about that. I haven't read that, but it was also the way that they could get to market was the ocean. And so the coast where I am, for example, way northwest coast, 3 miles off the ocean above a river, town of Annapolis had something like 9,000 people, had a post office, had a stop sign, et cetera. It's now about 45 people, no post office, no stop sign, and had all that because initially all those hilltops are where you could grow something, and it was not very good soil, not rich, low yields, but your highway was the ocean, and so you could just get it down to the ocean. Then they developed the Russian River, much more fertile, better yields, more access to water, and once they had the roads, that collapsed all coastal agriculture. Carneros got some of the early plantings because it's across the bay, and it was easy for them to get it to San Francisco and Oakland, and mostly San Francisco back then. So access really drove a lot. So what were the first hot places in California, or popular places to grow wine as California started really in earnest growing in the 70s? Carneros through the 80s, and up into Napa, and then up into Sonoma Valley. And then I started pushing Russian River and Dry Creek, and then eventually got out to the coast because the coast is remote, terrible yields, expensive to farm, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, which is what you and Nick deal with, right? But yes. for the betterment for us, I know you do it for us. Well, fantastic. So tell us about when, so we'll skip down to a little bit. So we really started planting, David Hirsch came in the 70s, right? We maybe started making wine or planted just before the 1980s. Is that correct?
Right.
Yeah. And then
there were a couple of vineyards before that. Those vineyards are already defunct, and the winery that was making wine out there is defunct now, Seaview. But there were a couple folks out there, Martinelli, Blue Slide Ridge, et cetera. Suma was a vineyard that came after that. But these are basically people who were kind of back to earthers, trying to get away from it. And really it was Bert Williams, who was going out to the coast, who had the idea, there's some interesting things out here, and I should go to cooler climates. I'm getting some things I want, acidity, florality, whatever. And we've had him speak years ago at one of our very first West Sonoma Coast weekends, and they couldn't give the fruit away initially. Right. And so he was making Suma and Hirsch and things like that, and really it wasn't until the 90s flowers came in and started planting in earnest. They kind of sparked people to start thinking about it. And then we were the first people up in the north, which is the Annapolis region up north.
Fantastic, cool. And I love, if nobody's read so far the new California wine by John Bond. It's a fantastic book. It references Peay a lot. I think it's going on a decade of being, 2013 it was written, but I really think it's still so relevant for today. It has such fantastic information in it about some of these producers and the search for these cooler climates, these more transparency in wine as well. These two men, Agustin Harasti, the father of California wine. He was commissioned by California to go back to Europe, and he brought over 100,000 cuttings, and we probably owe a lot of the grape varieties that are in California today to his work, going to France, Spain, Italy, bringing those back. Really important figure. And then, of course, Andrei Chalichev, who we know as well, really introduced not just the Napa Valley, but to American winemakers, this concept of hygiene within the winery and really, really pushing for excellence and for quality. So two men we always want to talk about when we discuss, California wine in general, I think, which is really important. So before we get to the West Sonoma Coast, how does it fit into California? So a lot of us have been to Sonoma, probably. I know we're talking about drinking some wine from some different areas here. I really think that this is a fascinating map because it shows the overlay of all of these AVAs, where in Sonoma, we talk a lot about nested AVAs in the US, but in Sonoma, in some areas, there are 3, 4, 5 AVAs deep that are overlaid atop one of another as they've really started to sort of dial in on the climate and the different soil types, which I think Andy will kind of discuss a little bit later on. But we have the whole county of Sonoma here. We can generally say there's a lot of grape varieties that are grown here, although I think about probably 7 grapes account for maybe 90% of the production here, I would imagine. We talk a lot about Pinot Noir, Chardonnay. These are primarily grown closer to the coast, at least they should be. And then when we move inland, we see a lot of Bordeaux-style grape varieties. A little bit warmer inland, the soil change a bit here. And if you're getting into Alexander Valley, Knights Valley, Bennett Valley, places like this, we're typically talking about these Bordeaux grape varieties. So you're seeing, of course, a lot more Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, sometimes things like a riper style of Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc as well. Now, maybe somebody wants to drink a wine from the Sonoma Coast. And I think actually I heard Jasmine Hirsch say it one time. She said, well, if somebody offered you a wine from the Sonoma Coast, the first thing you should say is, from where? Where is this on the Sonoma Coast? Because a coastal style of wine would imply that it has this cooling effect coming from whatever coast it's next to. So in this case, we're next to the Pacific Ocean. The cool ocean really creates almost like an air conditioning for this area. And I think it's fascinating within California, where we think about the coast as being so fantastic for grape growing, most of it probably is actually a little too foggy in some of these areas, I would imagine, because we get this sort of this fog layer that comes in, and this cool air gets sucked into the inland. It's kind of this vacuum effect, this hot interior, the air is rising and it's bringing in this cool air from the coast. So we see these cooler coastal areas. Well, now let's look at this map though. So this is what we think when we think Sonoma Coast, right? So the blue outline is Sonoma Coast. This makes sense. This makes sense. Okay, this makes sense, Sonoma Coast. Here we are a little bit further inland. Oh, here we go, pretty sharp, drastic turn inland. Well, we're surrounding Russian River Valley. We know Russian River Valley gets a fair amount of fog depending on where you're at. We know Green Valley gets a lot more than other places. Well, now we're all the way over here next to Alexander Valley, which is known for Bordeaux grape varieties. We're almost over here to Knights Valley, which is the warmest area within Sonoma County. And then here we are, now again, we're all the way down over here. We're in Carneros. Okay, we're getting a little bit cooler again. But when you think about this, there's a difference in probably growing degrees a temperature during the day of 20 degrees or sometimes more, I would imagine. So you really are, where? When you say Sonoma Coast, where are we talking about? Because if I had a Sonoma Coast wine, and if I was familiar with the concept of how a wine coming from a coastal area should taste, and somebody gave me a Pinot Noir or a Chardonnay coming from over here, I might not want to drink wine that said Sonoma Coast again, because maybe it's not what I was expecting, or as a consumer that I'm anticipating from what the label is telling me. So I think that brings some importance here, right? So talking about Sonoma Coast area. So sorry, I skipped ahead. I get excited sometimes. So a pretty large area, huge variation in soil type. And then Sonoma Coast has really become this sort of umbrella appellation, and it was sort of unfairly extended from its original boundaries, I would say, right? Which was...
It was created by a winery who wanted to be able to put his separate vineyards from around the county into something smaller than a Sonoma AVA.
Mm-hmm.
And the logic that he used, but he didn't have to really use any logic because the TTB was rubber stamping back then, was that the fog penetration, even though the fog does go into the Russian River Valley up to Chalk Hill and Sonoma Mountain and down to Carneros, that is the only thing it has in common, is that there's fog, but the fog burns off at different times, proximity to the ocean, wind, soil, elevation, all these other things that drive what type of grapes you have and therefore what type of wine you make were ignored. So it's a complete bastardization of what an AVA is supposed to do, which is to give you an idea that wines from those regions should have things in common because of where they are, so that you should have a general profile in the wines that you drink. And that is ridiculous, which is, I don't want to jump ahead, but that is why the West Sonoma Coast exists, is that I would go out and sell wine, and I would say we're from the Sonoma Coast, or the true Sonoma Coast, which is kind of pejorative. But what I meant was the actual coast of Sonoma. And, you know, people would be like, oh yeah, I have Sonoma Coast on my list or on my shelf. And I'd say, no, you have Carneros. And that wine tastes different based on where it's grown, and the cost is different, and everything about it is different. So that's what led us to form our organization in 2011. And now we have an AVA coming out any day.
Fantastic. And Fort Ross Seaview, the AVA was in 2012 when it was approved. It was also sort of a reaction to this huge expansion of the Sonoma Coast as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it's not so much an expansion of the Sonoma Coast, it was just the creation of the Sonoma Coast was a ridiculous AVA. It was half the county. But Fort Ross Seaview was an AVA trying to say, look, we're different out here. And they're actually even different from the rest of the West Sonoma Coast. I'm up at the north there, northwest in Annapolis. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I can see people's vineyards in Fort Ross Seaview, but they're higher elevation. And I'll get into that in a second, but basically they're 10 degrees warmer than we are because they're further away from that cold Pacific Ocean. So it's not just how close you are to the ocean. It's also like how many miles from the ocean, but your elevation above the ocean, how many ridges there are in between you, if any.
And I think the Fort Ross Seaview is an AVA that is based on elevation, right? Like if you're below a specific elevation, you won't qualify for the AVA, even if you're within those geographical boundaries.
That's right. You have to be 920 feet or above, and that's because the top of what they call an inversion layer is 920 feet. So why don't I just start to get into the details on that?
All right.
So, the Pacific Ocean's 53 degrees year round. We're having climate change, in case you hadn't heard. But really the ocean temperatures are really not changing that much. I mean, where they're increasing is having huge adverse effect on our ocean, marine life, but it's, 1 degree or so. So if you're above 1,000, up to about 1,000 feet or 920 feet above that huge cold mass of water, your air is very cool, and the further you get away, it warms up because you're getting further away from it, but it's like a big refrigerator there. It's also quite saturated with water. So when it hits the land, it's fog. So if you're above 1,000 feet, you're not really affected by the coolness or by the fog. If you're about 5 miles inland, you're far enough away from the ocean that after that fog burns off, it really heats up. All that land heats up. So if you're in the Russian River, especially tucked behind the ridges there, up in the Russian River, up in a dry creek in Anderson Valley and valleys, it gets quite warm. And that's because that's continental grape growing, like Burgundy, like the Rhone Valley. Continental, you get in these valleys where it heats up during the day and then it gets cooler at night when the fog sinks in there. So where we are on the West Sonoma Coast, can you go back a slide?
Yeah, of course.
So actually go to the West Sonoma Coast map at the very end, if you wouldn't mind.
This one or at the very end?
Yeah, that's great. So that red little line in the southeast corner, well, there you go, along the side, that's cutting off the Russian River. So what you can see that says West Sonoma Coast AVA, that's an AVA that we've gotten approval. It's just sitting on the treasurer's desk and they're busy right now and they swear it'll be any day. But that'll be a new AVA. And what that is saying is we are close enough to that big body of water that we are moderated. So in a typical day in the summer, where we are up in north and down in the south in Freestone, Occidental, and up in Annapolis, we don't get out of the high 60s at 3 p.m. in July. That's cold for grape growing. We'll get some days in the 70s. If we get offshores, it'll be warmer. But for the most part, quite cool. Way cooler than in Burgundy or continental regions in the summer because they're continental and it heats up. Now they have much colder shoulder seasons, so it's just different. I'm not trying to say we're cooler and we're better. It's just different. But what it means is heat drives accumulation of sugar. So we don't get as much sugar accumulation. So these longer growing seasons before our sugars get to where you have to pick them because there'll be too much alcohol. And we hold on to our acid. Doesn't respire as much because that's based on heat as well. So you can have wines, depending on when you pick, that have more acidity and brightness and freshness. And what it means is you have a longer growing season, which is good because we need it to get where we want to be. And we have October in California. It's a desert climate, doesn't rain during the summer, and we can get ripening in October. Whereas in continental regions, it starts raining, your vines shut down. You know, we've had lots of our friends who make wine in France come and say, when do you pick? And we say, oh, beginning of October through to November. And they're like, are you kidding me? We're done by the 3rd, 4th week of September because it's raining and the leaves have dropped. And we're like, yeah, it's just a different place where we are. It's cold climate, maritime grape growing. And that's pretty unique in the world. Most maritime grape growing, you know, the water heats up and so they're warmer. Think about Greece and the Mediterranean and things like that.
Fantastic. Well, why don't you go ahead? I'm going to stop sharing, Andy, so you can show us a little bit about what you have for showing us where we're at in the West Sonoma Coast. Like, where are the Peay Vineyards and how are they affected here?
Okay, so that's a picture of our vineyard. You'll notice it's also what I have as my screen background. But you can see the fog sitting there in the river. The ocean is out to your right, which would obviously be your west. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you way back and dial it in. So this is a picture of the western half of the US. You can see that big valley. That is the Central Valley of California. That's where a lot of your vegetables come from. And I'm now going to kind of focus in to San Francisco, about a little over halfway up the coast. And going to go north. Keep on going north. See this line here? That creates Tamaulipas Bay, Bodega Bay. That is the San Andreas Fault. Jenner, that's where the Russian River dumps out. So that is the Russian River Valley. Can you see my little pointer?
Yep.
That is Sonoma Mountain, Chalk Hill, Alexander Valley. Healdsburg is up here. So we're out here. What do you notice about out here is a lot of trees and ridge tops. And that's because the San Andreas Fault's right here. That creates your coastal ridges. That's where the Pacific Plate pushed the Farallon Plate underneath the North American Plate and created, and then subducted. And now it's a transversal movement, but it's fault line. But that's what created our coastal ridges. And you go up north a little bit. You can see the San Andreas Fault right here. little river that comes off the ocean, and that's where we are. So we're 4 miles off the ocean. We have this little river, 600 feet elevation in that inversion layer. That river is where our fog comes up. And that's what keeps us nice and cool during our growing season. And I'll kind of just zoom you in there for a second. We're up on a ridgetop. It looks kind of flat because of how this is done. But it's a 51-acre vineyard. And we were the first folks up there. People said it's too cold, too wet, too remote. They're not wrong. Our yields are highly erratic and on average low. And that's because you get dicey weather during flowering. You don't get, great fruit set, but very good quality if you're looking for the features we're looking for. We want aromatics, we want elegance, we want not just fruit, but floral and earth, tea. We want to be able to have harmonious wines, balanced wines that are not over encumbered with fruit or other things. So one of the things you notice out here is we have a reservoir. We cannot dry farm. We can dry farm now. We could not establish a vineyard dry farm. People who can establish vineyards and dry farm are either in continental regions where it rains in the summer, like Burgundy and a lot of France and Italy. They get rain. Or they are in valleys where there is access to water. And what we know about that is that that's a bad thing for quality. Because once those roots hit the sub-aquifers, vines are weeds, and they love to grow. And they put out all these shoots and green growth, and they just party. And that is not good for quality grape growing, because that's not going into the skin. And what we're making wine from, really that flavor is coming from the skin. So happy vines are not necessarily happy wines.
That's a great point. So tell me a little bit too, because I think this is something so interesting that we never get to focus on. Just give us a quick few moments about, first off, obviously we see why you had the need to establish the West Sonoma Coast AVA. But what did you and the other growers in this area that were petitioning to have this AVA established, what did that look like? What's the process of doing something like that?
Yeah, so in 2011 or 2010, I was sitting around with primarily one other guy, Carol Kemp, who at the time was the owner winemaker of Redcar. And he had put some vineyards in the Fort Ross Seaview area, and he was buying fruit from the Occidental Freestone area. And we were like, man, I'm just so tired of going out there and trying to make people understand that the coast is very different from the inland part of the Sonoma Coast. And, we said we really need to try to create a new region, but we didn't really understand our region. My area, nobody knew about because I was pretty much the only guy up there, one other vineyard. And down at Freestone Occidental, I didn't know anything about those guys. I know about my region. So we said, well, let's create a little kind of a quorum of quality winemakers from the region. And we'll form a new marketing association. We'll just start drinking each other's wine all the time. And we'll start holding seminars. We'll have we have big festivals in Occidental. And so it was Literai, Peay, Redcar, Fela, Freeman, and Joseph Phelps, the time they were called Freestone. And we formed an organization. We started holding what we called the West of West Wine Festival. We started taking it on the road, New York a bunch of times, Chicago, gone all over. And now I've drunk everybody's wines for 10 vintages. And I know all about all those different wineries' wines. I've heard them present and talk about the regions. I've been on all their vineyards. And now we have a pretty good idea. We have a lot of data about why we're different. It's not just, oh yeah, I feel like we're different and I taste the wines and they're different than they are from the ones in Carneros. It's very clear. And so we submitted an application back in 2015 for a new AVA. And that is a long-term project. Here we are 5 years later. We got accepted initially verbally in December, but it takes a long time for it to actually be, it went through public comment, got accepted, but just all the little final finishes and we'll have an AVA. It's not going to show up on my labels to 2020 because I had to print my 2019 labels, at least for my bottling coming up in August. But I think it's an AVA that you're going to start seeing pretty much anybody out on the coast who will use it because those wines out there are quite different. And for the most part, different price point as well. Our yields are different. All of us tend to farm organically or biodynamically or otherwise. We're all very focused on growing grapes to make wine and not doing things in the winery. And so I think, there's a certain degree of pride and a certain degree of delineation of using that West Sonoma Coast marker.
That's fantastic. And I think that, it seemed to me that actually interesting, again, so looking at like my own cellar, kind of researching for this, I realized how many of the wines that I enjoy from Sonoma were part of this organization and part of what's going to become this West Sonoma Coast AVA, because I was thinking, I have Ernest and Literai and Shayla, a great producer that I love, the Peay wine. I was just like, the gang's all here already. And just everybody watching. So when I say my cellar, it sounds fancy. And what I mean by that is it's the wine that's, shoved in the back of my closet and underneath my bed, currently in my apartment. Although I find that I get to drink a lot of wine these days. So I think that becomes pretty fun. Do you have anything else you want to share here on the screen, Andy?
No, I'm finished with that screen. Other than if you are drinking the 2017 Sonoma Coast Pinot.
I am.
Okay, those purple blocks, those are the Pinot blocks. It's 35 acres of 51-acre vineyard. And we make 4 different Pinots from the estate vineyard. So that Sonoma Coast Pinot is 100% estate.
That's fantastic.
We make 3 different wines first, and then the blocks that don't go in there go in that wine.
In 2017 was a great vintage. Did you see any, up where you were at, did you have any influence from the fires in 2017?
No, 2017 was a really interesting vintage for a lot of reasons. It was a vintage that really mattered where you are on the Sonoma Coast, in the West Sonoma Coast, because we got, one of the things that we're getting with climate change an offshore event is when our weather typically comes from the ocean onshore because it's warm in the interior valleys, hot air rises, creates a vacuum, pulls in the fog off the coast. Well, an inversion or a offshore is when that switches and we get all the interior heat coming out to the coast. So it might be 110 degrees in Napa and we might get up to 90 out on the coast. Well, where we are, because up in Annapolis, around Labor Day, we always get an offshore event. It's usually 2-3 days and we get really warm temperatures. We're only sitting at 18 bricks. So we're not close to picking, but people in a little bit warmer places up like Fort Ross Seaview or down in the non-West Sonoma Coast part of the Sonoma Coast, they're probably sitting around 22. And we got not 1, we got 2, but 3 offshores back to back, 9 days straight, 90 to 100 degrees. And that made some tricky wines. So you'll see some unevenness, people who ripeness got out of hand. So there are some 2017 wines that you're like, whoa, a lot of fruit, very bold. But then there are people that, people like us or other people slightly cooler temperatures where that pushed us to 21 bricks, but it didn't, then it was very cold for 3 weeks. So it really makes a difference. One of the things about Sonoma County, to go back to your original talk about Sonoma County, is we have more microclimates than France. We have more soils than France, just in our county. And that means that where you are matters. So if you've ever been, in San Francisco, for example, if you're in San Francisco and you drive over to the Mission from the Haight, it's a totally different day. It's blue skies and 10 degrees warmer. And that's how it is up in wine country. So it really matters where you are. And that's kind of cool. And that's why we have all these different little AVAs, and that's why you're going to see it tightening up over time. And you're no longer going to see overlapping AVAs. That's illegal now. But you're going to see them further defining over time as we're like, oh, that's very different from that.
Very cool. Wow. Fantastic. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about what makes the sort of, we've been discussing it here and there, but let's talk a little bit about, you kind of discussed the inversion layer here. I do think that these pictures just say it all when you see these vines that are just barely sitting above these fog that's blanketing the rest of the forest. It's pretty amazing here. But what about
and that fog? That just burned off like 10 minutes before that photo. It will be 10 degrees colder when that fog is there, and then it burns off. And you're like, oh hey, now we're in the high 50s, getting to low 60s, and it might just sit there all day, and then the wind comes off the coast at noon every day. That's like a refrigerator having a fan blowing off the chiller in the fridge. And hottest time of the day for us is 11:59, because at noon temperatures then drop again, keeping us in that mid to low high 60s. It really is kind of neat. Some days it doesn't happen, but most days that's how it is.
There's not where do you have a tasting room?
We're open by appointment at the vineyard or winery, but we don't have like a tasting room with marketing staff. So you see my brother, who's a farmer and is on his tractor and in the vineyard every day, and will jump down rabbit holes with you if you're interested in talking about something specific. And he'll take you around. And then at the winery, we'll barrel taste and do things like that. But it's not, one of the differences about Sonoma and specifically West Sonoma Coast versus maybe Napa or other more developed regions is you're going to see the people who are doing it. And there's no marketing staff, there's no fancy fountain. And it's a much more personal, intimate experience. We do now have maybe 3 Michelin star dining at Single Thread, but not as fancy in Sonoma County.
Right. Fantastic. Cool. We talked a little bit about the climate. We went over here. Let's talk a little bit about this geology and soil, because I think that that's a really fascinating thing that you said about the concept of just in Sonoma County itself, you have more soil type than you have in all of France. That's pretty amazing.
Can I show you something cool? Can I share? Can you open your screen? I want to share something.
You got it.
Okay. Let's see if I can find it. Okay. So everybody see that picture? That is the Pacific Plate kind of moving west, northwest. North American Plate kind of moving a little bit west too. And it's hitting that Farallon Plate, which is kind of getting a little bit which is going east, southeast. That Farallon Plate gets pushed under the North American Plate. And you can see the Farallon Plate's getting pushed under, and it's pushing up these uplifted ocean sediments. And there are these interior lakes, and where I am up on the northwestern Sonoma Coast in Annapolis, we're an uplifted seabed that had all these silica and quartz deposits that then got uplifted and mixed with all these marine soils. So if you ever hear people talk about gold-ridge soils down in the Occidental Freestone and Russian River Valley, that's the mud soils, the marine soils. And then we have the silica stuff, so we're our own little thing up in Annapolis. But I know that you had a slide that I think I have here too that shows the soils of Sonoma County. So that's the purple stuff. That's those Gold Ridge, Wilson Grove Formation. We got some of that up here in my region as well. And then we got some of that silica. And then you can see these other soils, yellow, red, blue. Those are all different types of Franciscan's, the really old bedrock soils, volcanic stuff. That's kind of the base underneath our soils too. You see the appellations underneath here. That's what those numbers are. They somewhat correspond to soil type, not totally. What else can I show you about soils that are cool? Far left here, the Bodega Head, San Andreas Fault, Shell Beach Jenner. That's just showing you the different Franciscan complexes, that green melange here that's right there. Mm-hmm. Then that's perhaps getting a little bit too specific, but you're seeing how old it is to young in age.
But I think it's actually really fascinating because it shows you what a difference that you really can get in some of these different vineyards, probably even in the West Sonoma Coast. Like I know you're a little bit further north, but Fort Ross Seaview, I think Hirsch, which is part of the West Sonoma Coast Vintners, they farm on multiple different soils within their vineyard, don't they? And they sort of make a lot of their wines based on the soil type that their grapes are actually coming from, especially for the Pinot Noirs that are such a translator of the soil that they're grown in.
Yeah, so they are much more of that melange. Not only uplifted seabed, but more of that Franciscan. They have more Franciscan, they're higher up. They have more of that volcanic soils. So they have a mix. And what David's learned over the years is that, wow, that block's different from that block. They have the same aspect, similar elevation. It's the soil. Where we are, we have fairly uniform, but we have a lot of silica deposits and things. So we're different in our uniformity than the Wilson Grove stuff that's down in Freestone Occidental, which is a little bit more uniform. And then when you get down to the Russian River, those are all alluvial soils and a lot more fertile, a lot more, you get higher yields and a lot more water access and everything else. When Vanessa worked in Burgundy, she said, last week I did a class with her on geology, and she was talking about how she was at Jean Gros, and she was standing there and she had one foot in one Grand Cru vineyard and 1 foot in the other. And it was, 3 feet apart. She's a small lady, so not that far apart. She could put a foot in each. And they were distinct. And they'd figured that out over time just by looking at the fruit that was coming off it and the vine and how it was growing differently. And it was based on the different deposits that happened geologically as those fans were coming off of the coast of the Côte d'Or there. And, we're figuring out that too. It's just taking us a while. We're doing it a lot faster. But we also have the benefit of science and a bunch of other things. And we're just figuring it out.
Yeah, I would say we're doing it much faster when you consider that in Burgundy, this has taken place over, almost a millennia or more when you think about it this way of sort of defining these sites. You're right, without science, just by year after year making wine from one grape out of these sites and then just mapping out almost by taste the difference between these sites. It's pretty amazing.
Well, and another complicating factor is that no variables are held uniform. So in our case, we have 15 clones of Pinot, 7 Chardonnay, 6 Syrah. So all those clones make a difference. Rootstocks, we have 6 different rootstocks. That makes a huge difference. Age of vines. So you're making these assessments and it turns out 10 years later, you're like, that had probably more to do with vine age than it had to do with, whatever other variable you were trying to say was responsible for that quality. So yeah, it's.
Do you find that most of the producers in the West Sonoma Coast are using a lot of similar clonal material? Is there sort of a specific clones like Pommard versus Dijon, or some of those Dijon versus some of those kind of what are considered like California clones like Calera and Swan? Is there sort of a big drive toward ones that are really working for this area?
Yeah, so the 2 classifications people use are Dijon clones because they went through the University of Dijon to be classified and numbered and given 3 digits, 667, 777, 115, 828, things like that, 114. So if they have 3 numbers, they're Dijon clones. Those were analyzed genetically, said that they're distinct, and here are their qualities. If they have numbers that are single numbers or 2 numbers, they've gone through UC Davis or Geneva in New York. And those are just distinct clones. And then there's what we call a heritage selections, and those are just names. And what that means is that somebody went from either a vineyard and took a cutting. Now all the let's say I took a cutting from Calera. Josh Jensen didn't plant 1 clone. Josh Jensen got a bunch of different cuttings, probably from France, probably from vineyards he liked, and planted them what they call, selection massal, just all over the place. And then people went to his vineyard and said, hey, I want your clone. There is no clone. Just they cut a couple, who knows which one. And then they took it to their vineyard and they called it the Calera selection. I have 3 different Calera selections. They taste somewhat similarly. They all have leaf roll. They're virused. So they all have different problems and terrible yields. And some so bad that we had to rip them out and replant. But they have a certain quality we like. And so we give them the name Calera. Pommard, same deal. Swan, Joe Swan, he also had a bunch of different things and people propagated them. I have 2 different Swan selections. So as far as who's planting what in the Pinot Noir world, I think people like both. They don't like certain heritage selections. Martini's not loved. Vaudeville's not loved except for by people up in Oregon. They tend to crop a lot and be pretty thin. Dijon clones kind of became available in the mid to late 90s. So a lot of us planted them. I have a bunch of them. Some of them have determined not to be as good as others. I don't have as much 828 as I used to have. Some of them got a bad rap because people were making assessments of those clonal selections when they were very young vines, saying they're too fruity. It's like, well, yeah, young vine Pinot Noir, no matter what it is fruity. As it gets 10, 15, 20 years old, it loses that baby fat and gets much more interesting. So I like some of the Dijon clones. I'm about 50-50 in my planting.
Well, I think it makes, what I think a lot of people say is if anybody watching this class, if you're interested in the concept of clones, which I think can be a little daunting to get into, but it's a really interesting conversation, and especially to have with a winemaker or a grape grower, when you really start to see that, a single clone doesn't really make a wine. It's sort of like a piece of the puzzle, and it's or paint or different colors that you sort of use to create the finished wine in the bottle, sort of the painting or the picture, I guess I would say, in a way.
Well, that's the analogy that I use. Is it's like a painter. We have 13 clones, so we have 13 colors on our palette. If I had 2 clones, I'd have 2 colors. You can, more of this, less of that. You can layer it, but you're kind of boxed in a little bit. With all these different colors, I can layer them, create depth. I can have top notes, medium notes, base notes, because each of those Pinot wines, we make 30 different Pinots. We pick those 15 clones into 30 blocks, keep them separate. They'll have some that are floral, some that are earthy, some that have mid-palate, some that have donuts in the middle. Because we have all these ones, we can layer them to create a wine that's complete, top notes, middle notes, base notes, but that each has its own unique profile.
That's very cool. I know that you do make most of the wines. So actually, I know a couple of things that you do, but one is that so many of the wines come from your estate vineyard. And I want to hear a little bit more about the Rhone varieties and what you're doing with those as well. But I know you also have a label called CEP that does focus on sourcing some fruit coming from both your own vineyard and then Russian River Valley. But I know that you also make a wine from Anderson Valley as well, which is a little bit of a departure from mostly focusing on your estate fruit from Richard Savoy's vineyard, right?
Yeah, so there is no good reason for us to make anything that's not from my estate. We are so very, very focused on our estate and bringing out the site expression in our wines. That's the whole reason we live. That's why we went out to the middle of nowhere. That's what we're all about. Until 2010, when I lost half my crop. And I said, wow, I've got full-time employees year-round in the vineyard, salaried benefits. All my costs are fixed, basically, except for labeling and stuff like that. So I'm going to go out of business when my yields go in half. And so in 2011, I lost 70% of my crop, and I really panicked. And fortunately, I'd been moaning about it to the guy who just bought Richard Savoy's vineyard, Cliff Lede, and he said, well, hey, man, he was on my mailing list. He's like, I'd love your Pinot. I'd love to sell you some Savoy fruit. And I said, great. So we started making Savoy in 11, which was fortuitous because I lost 70% of my crop that year. I only make 350 cases, but the idea was if I'm going to go off my vineyard, it's got to be from a vineyard that's making Pinot Noir, has the potential to make Pinot Noir that has site expression, has florality, has earthiness. And I love Savoy for those qualities. Yeah, some people make Savoy that's a bit bigger than ours, but we get some of the older blocks of Calera and Pommard that have more floral notes. And I think Vanessa makes a really beautiful expression of Savoy. I had the 2014 for dinner last night. I'm at my parents' house. They had an older bottle. We love being able to make wine from such old vines. That's an older vineyard. And old vines are great. They rock. They can withstand weather, and they can really, I think, pull out some wonderful expression. So our vineyard's only 20 years old. It's in making better wines every year, and it's nice to be able to make it from a 30, 35-year-old vineyard.
Very cool. And what about your CEP label? I know the Sauvignon Blanc, the Rosé are both fantastic.
So CEP, Syrah, and Pinot is 100% estate barrels that don't go into Peay, and that's why it was made. It was basically making the Peay wines. We make all our blends blind to production, saying this is what we think is the best expression. And then Vanessa says, well, I have 15, 20 barrels that didn't go in. Half price, put under a different label, nobody's wise about it. And it can go by the glass or be 25, 30 bucks, and there it is. CEP means vine stock in French. And then I like crisp, bright, fresh, intentional Vin Gris style of rosé. So in 09, I said to my brother, look, our grapes are way too expensive to make a $20 rosé. And he was in organic grape growing classes with a guy whose family grows fruit in the Russian River, started buying Pinot, made a rosé. Guy gave us some Sauvignon Blanc for free because we were like, we don't want to make Sauvignon Blanc. He's like, yeah, just check it out. Matanzas Creek uses it. We made it. And we're like, wow. So we make this very, very linear, bright, super high acid rosé and Sauvignon Blanc from a vineyard named Hopkins in the Russian River Valley. It's across from Copain. It's a warm area. It is the Russian River Valley, East Side Road, but we pick it early and we make it super bright, super fresh, salty.
Very cool. And then tell me a little bit about, we haven't talked so much, so a little bit about the Rhone varieties that you're making, Syrah, Viognier, Marsanne, Roussanne. And I'm also really curious because I know, Vanessa has, such a pedigree behind her in terms of the wineries that she's worked at, but they sound like they're primarily Burgundian or Bordelais grape varieties. So when she came to be working with Rhone varieties, how was that just sort of a learn on the job type of situation?
Yeah, and she was like, why are you doing this? So she wasn't around when we planted. So we got the budwood and everything in 96, 97, planted in 98, the first 30 acres. She didn't show up till 2001.
And,
so she inherited.
You and Nick planted the vineyard yourself, didn't you?
Yeah, with, we had a crew join us, but my brother and myself were full-time farming every day for 2 years until I decided I was going to kill him if I didn't leave the vineyard. We basically love cold climate Syrah. It's my favorite grape variety or style. So we said, well, let's plant a little bit to see what happens. Because we know it's cold out here. We know it should be cold out here, but no one's really ever planted up in Annapolis. So maybe we're wrong. So we planted it, not even realizing about October, not realizing that, yeah, we'll get it ripe if your definition of ripe is the style we make, and if you're okay with waiting until the last week of October, first week of November, and getting very low yields. We planted Viognier because my brother grew it, or worked for Bill Smith at La Hota, who grew it on Howe Mountain, where it was very warm, and he was like, the problem was it was flabby and kind of one-dimensional. I'll plant a little bit out on the coast, see what it's like. And we also planted a little bit of Roussanne, a little Marsanne. We love Chauve Hermitage Blanc. What the hell? We didn't plant a lot of it, less than an acre. It doesn't actually get ripe half the time, so we don't make it. But when we do, it's really cool. So we still make that wine when we do, and we make about 40 cases.
That's very cool. So tell us a little bit about, you sent me all of this great information, and these maps that you have sort of look like you're attempting to further define this West Sonoma Coast into subregions as well, based probably on, I would assume, their soil type, but particularly the climate.
Yeah, well, it's based on everything. It's climate, soil. So if you look at that map in the northwest corner, you see an Annapolis, a region named Annapolis. That is not an actual AVA. It may be. That is just a map that my brother drew of what is kind of the watershed around that river that goes out to the ocean, the Wallala River. And it's at about 600 to 800 feet elevation, so we're still in that inversion layer. It's got a lot of fog because of it comes up that valley. Its temperatures are cool. It's got that high silica mixed with marine soil, sedimentary soil. We're going to start probably putting effort into making that an AVA in a few years. We first want to get the West Sonoma Coast made. When you look down, I don't think you can see my pointer, but if you move your pointer just a little bit to the right, okay. See how Occidental has two shades of red? Mm-hmm. So that line that goes through there, To the west of it, to the left of it, that's the West Sonoma Coast. To the right of it, that's the Russian River.
Okay.
So the left part's going to be in the West Sonoma Coast. The right part is not. We'd like it to be because it's actually in our watershed. It's not in the Russian River watershed. Same with that little corner of Freestone. If you keep going down, that little bitty corner is actually in the Freestone Valley. It's not in the Russian River watershed. And that's a big pain in the rear because that little section is a very important vineyard owned by Joseph Phelps. You know, we hope to someday have that in our AVA, but it's not going to be for right now. But that Occidental Freestone will probably not end up being 2 AVAs. They'll probably end up being 1. We'll find out, but that's going to be an AVA. The Occidental Freestone AVA is something that we're working on. Again, there you go.
Oh, you want to go back?
No, go to that next one. Yeah. See that Freestone Occidental? That's what we think that's going to look like. We'll see. You know, I mean, there's time. We're just gathering data, literally just started. We first want to get that West Sonoma Coast AVA made.
Well, thank you. This has all been absolutely fascinating. I really have to say, like, it's so cool to hear the entire process that's going into why do we, I think it's important because, well, first off, as a wine professional or somebody that's interested, even if you're just a consumer or wine enthusiast, why do we study all of the things that we've talked about today? Why do we talk about the climate, the soil, the wine laws, the delimiting of these regions? And for you, like, you really just kind of brought it all to light today, which I think is really fascinating with the concept of creating this appellation, this AVA, to focus on not only what this, like you said, like the soil and the climate that is so different than the rest of this county, but also sort of the camaraderie and the philosophy of the winemakers that are in it, which I think is so cool. Which I just love so many of the winemakers. This is, you know, some of the West Sonoma Coast producers. This is not a completely extensive list. It doesn't have all of them, but it does just have some of the wines that we have always offered here at Corkbuzz. I pulled this out today. I didn't open it up, but we love the earnest wine coming from this region. If you bought one of our backpacks this week, you're probably enjoying one of these wines because they were both in it. The earnest Chardonnay and the Peay 2017 Sonoma Coast Pinot Noir, which is absolutely beautiful. Andy, I opened it at probably about 3 o'clock today, and I was so excited. I was like, I cannot wait until 6:30 tonight to drink this wine. I opened it and it's just, I think, we have talked a little bit about the expression of the wine, but wine should be impactful, and that doesn't always mean in terms of the body, in terms of the weight. And I love the wine coming from this area and what you have in this glass in 2017, because it has so much concentration in terms of aroma and flavor and complexity, but it's not stolid, it's not heavy, it's more of this kind of ethereal, really beautiful wine. And I'm, not just saying that because you're here, I'm saying it because I actually think it's a really beautiful example of what we're finding out here coming from the coast. But then I guess the last thing I want to leave with, and this is for my own edification, because I always love to ask this of winemakers or winery owners, people that work with these wines. When you're not drinking your own wine, what do you like to drink?
I like to drink wine from all over the world. I drink a lot of wine. I buy a lot of wine. I don't say collect because I plan on drinking in my lifetime, but I have a lot of wine. I love cold climate Syrah, so a lot of Northern Rhone wines, a lot of Nebbiolo-based wines, some Sicilian. I love white Burgundy. I don't drink a lot of red Burgundy. When it's great, but oftentimes it's not, and it's disappointingly not because it's so expensive. I like dry Riesling. I like some U.S. wines very much. I think people in California and Oregon are making better wine than they've ever made. In the past 20 years, I think there's some really exciting wine being made. My cellar used to be 95% European. It's probably now about 70% European. I think people are making good wine everywhere, and I think that's really fun for consumers. I think having more confidence in yourself and what you're drinking and what you like will only open doors.
I completely agree. Absolutely. Does anybody have any, sorry, I was so engrossed. I like not even been, I'm just gonna stop share here. I haven't even really been checking the chat because I literally was so engrossed in everything that Andy had to say. Where do you, Natalia, you're asking where do you shop for wine? Are you asking for the Peay wines or just in general? Let's see. Well, we have the Peay wines here. I'm actually tomorrow going to send a little follow-up with the class and what we can offer you from Peay, of course. I don't know where, Andy shops. Are you based in Berkeley, right?
Yeah, I'm based in the East Bay. So I have the great fortune of having a dual license so I can buy wholesale. So I buy a lot of wine from importers and wholesalers. Also, I like a lot of my friends' wines, so I oftentimes trade with my friends. I buy from some of the gray market folks, who have various lists and can get stuff that they can allocate to me. And then there's some amazing wine shops around me. Paul Marcus Wines in Berkeley, if you live in the East Bay, and some great ones in San Francisco, Flatiron, and Harlequin, and Ferry Plaza, and Verve. You have a Verve where you guys are too. And there's just good wine everywhere. The best thing to do, what you've already done with Corkbuzz, is you establish a relationship with somebody who understands your palate, and their job is to feed you. And I was a retailer, and I loved it when I got somebody figured out. It took me 2-3 iterations just to figure out what their palate was about. And they walk in the door, and I'm like, ooh, I have your wine. What's your price point? What are you eating? When do you want to drink it? And then they come back, and they'd be like, yes. You're like, yes. That's really fun. And then you don't drink a ton of wines that, people, your friend who supposedly knows a lot about wine tells you this is a great wine, and then you drink it and you're like, wow, I don't know. I didn't think it was great. Maybe I just don't have a good palate. It's like, no, you just have a different palate than your supposedly wine-loving, wine-knowledgeable friend. You need to find the retailer whose job is just to create profiles and will fit you into a profile and then feed you your profile.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think one of the strengths I really think that we excel at Corkbuzz is trust from our guest and the opportunity to introduce people to new style of wines. And I think that people understand that what we do at Corkbuzz is, we always like to say our list is 60% classic, 40% like fun, unusual, maybe esoteric. But I think it gives us the opportunity, we gain trust, and then we use that trust to introduce our guests to maybe producers that they're not familiar with, to maybe stepping up in a price point when they want to, it's like playing with your money with wine is hard. There's nothing worse than buyer's remorse, especially when it comes to wine, right? So it's like we really have that trust, and I love that about what we do. And then the last thing I wanted to say is just when you said you love drinking your friends' wines, I think that's so important too. And I kind of thought about that sentiment when you said, well, you guys got together and just started drinking wine. And really, usually this all comes about because of a party, right? So, I mean, that's why we're here, and that's what we do together with wine. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Very nice to meet you all. I hope when we are able to come to New York that I see some of your faces.
Absolutely. And we'll talk again about that dinner when things are back to dinner party time.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Andy. Thank you, everybody. Talk to you soon.
See you later, Amber.
Bye.
Thank you.